Hey guys, today I'm going to show you how to create these two dynamic text animations using clone layers in Apple Motion. This kind of builds on the last video I posted where I used clone layers to create glass panes on video effects. If you didn't see that, you might want to check that one out first because I kind of explain more about how clone layers work. All right, let's just dive into this tutorial. All right, the first title we're going to work on is this multiplier effect. Here in the Motion Project browser, I'm going to select Final Cut Title, and we're going to have a preset of 4K, 24 frames per second, and the duration is going to be 6 seconds. Let's hit open. And the first thing I'm going to do is delete out the default elements here in my project. So I'm going to select them both in my project pane and hit the delete key. Now let's add our own text. I'm going to grab the text tool here and we're going to type out the word multiplier. And over here in my inspector, let's tweak this a little bit. I'm going to use the font Phosphate with the solid treatment. Let's center up that text. Let's crank up the size all the way up to 288. Let's head on over to the Properties tab in our inspector window and reset these parameters to get everything centered. And the last thing I'm going to do is just use my ruler here to mark my center line here in my canvas. And let's head back over to the Text tab in the inspector window and change the baseline so that we're really centered here. We're at -90. All right, I'm gonna get rid of that ruler line. And before I go any further, I should remind you that if you want access to these working files, you can join my Patreon community. All of my patrons get access to my working motion files if you want to dig into my projects and see how I build them. So if you're interested in that, head on over to my Patreon. I will link to it below. All right, let's get back to the project. The first thing I want to do is add a blur in effect to this text. So I'm going to select it in my project pane, head on up to behaviors. We're going to go to text, basic, and blur in. And down here in my timeline, I want to reduce this behavior to just 14 frames. So I'm going to queue up my playhead to the 14 frame mark and then just hit the O key to trim the blur to that point. Now in the inspector window, let's play with these elements here. I'm going to drop down on the controls menu and let's change the animate line to all. So now the whole thing just blurs in. And then the next step we want to take is head over to the text tab, go to appearance, and this blur in behavior does have a glow effect on it. You can see it's kind of yellow. Even though the glow is not enabled in my inspector window, I want to change this to just white. All right, that's my blur in. I'm going to queue up my playhead to the 15 frame mark in my timeline. I'm going to select the multiplier text, so I'm no longer selected on that blur in behavior. And let's head on over to the inspector, select the text tab, and then head on over to format. And let's add a keyframe here on size. Now I'm going to jump 10 frames in my timeline by just holding down the shift key and arrowing over once. That jumps me 10 frames. And let's modify the size and add a new keyframe. Let's go to 225 here. Let me just play that back. So the text just shrinks down. Now let's play with the motion here in our keyframe editor. If you're not seeing your keyframe editor, I say this every time. I hope you guys know this by now. At the top right of your timeline, you want to make sure you have these 3 diamonds enabled. That reveals this other mini timeline down here. This is your keyframe editor. I'm going to select both of these keyframes by dragging a white box around them with my mouse. Right click and let's change the interpolation to Bezier. And now we're going to get these handles on each of our keyframes. Let me just select one here. You can see I can change the curvature of my lines. I'm going to make like a backward S curve here. And so that's the motion I get when I play with those tangents down in my keyframe editor. All right, I'm happy with that. Let's add some other motion using keyframing here. So from my 15 frame point, I'm going to go another 15 frames, so jump 10 by holding down shift and arrowing over, and then arrow over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. That gives me 15 frames. Let's add a keyframe here on tracking. And then let's jump 20 more frames in my timeline, and let's change that tracking value to 68%. And again, in my keyframe editor, let's play with the interpolation. We're gonna make these Bezier, and this time I'm going to make an S curve, but in the proper S direction. So that's the motion we get there. These types of curves are entirely a matter of preference, and you just kind of get a feel for them when you play around with them a little bit. All right, let's add some more keyframes here. So I'm going to start from my last keyframe, and I'm going to jump 50 frames. I'm going to add another keyframe on the tracking line, but I'm not going to play with that value here. And then let's jump another 20 frames and reduce that tracking so everything's kind of clumped together. I think at around the -70 mark should do it. And then here in our keyframe editor, I'm going to select those keyframes again, right click, you guessed it, Bezier. On this one, I've got tangents now on both sides. So I really just want to isolate this side here. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to break the tangents. This is going to allow me to adjust just this tangent on its own. So we get that real snapping motion. Okay, that looks good. Now let's clone this text so we get another version of it that we can play with. So I'm going to select it in my project pane and I can either right click and select make clone layer, or I can hit the K shortcut. And now we have two versions of our text. I am going to disable the original multiplier text here so we can just focus on that clone layer, and I'm going to add some filters to this. The first thing I'm going to do is select it in my project pane, head on up to filters, let's go to stylize and let's select edges. And so now this text is just an outline. With the clone layer with text, I can't modify the text properties like I could with the original version. So to get that outline, we need to select the edges filter under the filters tab. Let's crank up that intensity. Okay, now let's add another filter to that clone layer. Filters, we're gonna go blur, we're gonna go prism, and I wanna keyframe the amount of the prism, and I really want the prism to get really strong when the text tracks out right here. So let's cue up our playhead to about this point. Head on over to the inspector under filters. Let's add a keyframe for amount and dial that amount down to 0. Now I'm just going to eyeball this. I'm going to run my playhead down in my timeline, maybe to about that point where I feel like the motion is really accelerated before it slows down. And let's crank up the amount on that prism. And then let's jump to where the motion stops and dial the amount down again. All right, in our keyframe editor, I'm just going to select those keyframes and let's just do an ease both on all of those keyframes. And now I'm going to select that clone layer in my projects and let's go to the properties tab and just scale up the text so it kind of fills the frame. And so this is what our project looks like thus far. Now what I do want though is for the bigger text, the outline text, to come in later. And with clone layers in text projects, they behave a little bit differently than you expect. Let me show you what I mean. If this were a regular motion project, I could just trim this clone layer and it would just cut off all of the movement and all of this keyframing we have here with our original multiplier text. However, with text projects, they don't behave that way. You'll notice these keyframes here, let's say on my prism filter, move along with the clone layer, and see how they get closer together the shorter I make the clone layer. And then if I scrub my playhead, you see that that clone layer is operating on a bit of a delay. There's something about text projects in motion that the clone layers act differently than if you made this a generator, let's say, or just like a regular motion composition. So we're gonna have a quick little workaround. Super easy. What I'm going to do is queue up my playhead to where I want my clone layer to come in. So I'm gonna put it here right before the tracking change starts. I'm going to select that clone layer, head on over to properties. On the opacity line, we're going to add a keyframe and we are going to dial the opacity down to 0. Then I'm going to arrow over one frame in my timeline and crank the opacity up to 100. So it really just pops on. And then we're going to move down to where in the timeline the text starts to track together, right about here. And we're going to have the clone layer kind of fade out less abruptly. So again, selected on that clone layer. Let's make a keyframe on the opacity line at 100. And I'm just going to arrow over like 3 frames in my timeline and dial that opacity back down to 0. Now that we've keyframed that opacity, there is one other filter we need to apply. Let me just show you why. If I drop a color solid here into my project, and let me drag that clone layer above it just to show you, you can see that my text isn't really just an outline like it appears over the black background we've been working with here in Motion. The text is actually filled with black. I want this text not to have any fill at all, just have the outline. So the filter we need to add is the Luma Keyer. You can find it under Filters, Keying, Luma Keyer. And here in the inspector window, you don't really need to make any adjustments here. You can just leave it as is. And now you can see our text is truly outline only. All right, let me get rid of that color solid. And I'm going to drop that clone layer back down in this group. All right, so to wrap up this animation, we're left right now with this cluster of letters where we pulled our tracking in really tight. And the effect I want to create is for these letters to just kind of like disappear into nothing. So I'm going to be cropping this text from left to right equally. Now, if you select the text in your project pane, head on over to properties in your inspector window, you'll see that cropping is not an option with text. So we have a little workaround. We're going to group this text by right-clicking it in the project pane, selecting group. And now we've got a group with just that text in it. That's all it's in there. And when we select that group, head on over to properties. You can see that we do have the crop option now. I'm going to enable crop. Let's queue up our playhead here to just a few frames before the end of our tracking animation. And I'm going to create keyframes on both the left and right crop. And then let's run our playhead down a little bit further in our timeline. And let's crop to a value of 90 on both of these. And then of course, let's open up our keyframe editor here. I'm going to select both of these keyframes. Interpolation, you guessed it, Bezier. And I'm just going to play with the curve and the timing of those so it feels like it really snaps together. Now, before we publish this to Final Cut, we need to think about what components of this we want to be able to adjust in Final Cut without having to open this project in Motion again. And for me, what really sticks out is that I would like to be able to adjust the opacity of that clone text in Final Cut. But because we keyframed the opacity already, we don't really want to be messing with that at this point. So I'm going to group this clone layer. And then under that group, under properties, let's publish the opacity there. And then head on up to project in our project pane. And then in the project tab in the inspector, it says opacity. Let's rename this so we remember what that slider does when we open it in Final Cut. All right, so to publish this, let's head up to File, Save As. We're going to get this pop-up window. It wants to know the name of our template. I'm going to call this Multiplier Text. Under the category, I have my own category here called Jen's Titles. Under Theme, I'm just going to leave it, and let's hit Publish. All right, let's create this other text effect using clone layers again. Here we are in our project browser one more time. Settings are going to be the same. We're going to be creating a Final Cut title. Preset is 4K 24 frames, 6-second duration. Let's open it up. Again, I'm going to go ahead and delete these existing elements in the project pane. We're going to once again create our own text. Under the inspector window, let's change this font to Montserrat. And I'm going to make the style black. Again, let's crank the size of this all the way up to 288, center the alignment, head on over to properties and reset all these parameters. And again, drag my ruler, go back to the text tab in the inspector window and change my baseline so it's nice and centered. All right, I'm at 95 here. That looks right to me. Let me get rid of that ruler. So the next thing we need to do is make this project 3D. Let's head up to the top of the screen, add object and add a camera. And let's create our box effect here. So I'm going to hit K to clone this text once and hit K to clone it one more time. I'm going to disable the top clone. Let's focus on the first clone layer. And we want to be selected on the anchor point tool here. So I can grab that in my tools menu down here in the bottom left of the canvas, or I can right click in my canvas view and select the anchor point tool. And what I want to do is place this anchor point at the top of my text. And now I want to head on over to the inspector window, drop down on the rotation options here. And now I want to rotate that clone layer to a -90 value. And now I'm going to take my camera here, and under rotation on the camera, I just want to change the view of what I'm seeing. So I'm just going to rotate here on the Y, and I want to reposition this clone layer that we've rotated here so that it falls behind my original text on the Z space. So I'm going to select the clone layer, and I'm going to drop down on position, and I'm going to reduce the Z value to where those two text elements are almost touching. Just look here in my perspective window that pops up. Do you see what I'm getting at here? So now that's like the top of my box. All right, now I'm going to enable the other clone layer. I'm going to go to the camera here and reset my view. So we're looking straight on one more time. On that clone layer, we're going to adjust the anchor point again, bringing that anchor point all the way to the top. And we're going to adjust the X rotation again. This time I'm going to rotate to a +90 value. Let's select that camera again. And I'm just going to rotate one more time and play with the placement of this other clone layer. This one, I actually want it to go down to match the bottom corner of my original text. So we're going to play with the Y position here. So this is the look we're going for. We want a box with just 3 sides. We don't want to fill out the 4th side of this. I'm going to select my camera and I'm going to reset the rotation here. So we're back at the front. And now we're going to fine tune the rotation of both of my clone layers. Now I did make them 90-degree changes. So theoretically we should be seeing the perfect side of the text, but because of the perspective and we're working in 3D, it doesn't quite work that way. So we need to find the sweet spot where these 2 clone layers here completely disappear from our frame. So I'm going to select the first one and let's head on over to the X rotation, and I'm going to change this value by 1 degree. Let's go -89. Okay, that's a bit of an improvement. I'm going to change now by 10th increments to try to get that to completely disappear. Okay, I think that did it. So for me, it was -88.7. Let's do that with the other text. While I'm futzing with this, you guys, if you like this tutorial, if you feel like you're learning something, let me know. Give me that thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and ring the bell. All right, we found our sweet spot. Took a minute on that second one. -91.2 is what I got. All right, I'm going to zoom back out on my canvas here. And now you can't see our clone layers at all, but I promise you they are there. All right, let's add some motion to our original box flip text. The first thing I'm going to do is select it in my project pane, head on over to filters. Let's go to distortion and let's select the black hole filter. This is one I don't really play with a lot, but I thought it might be fun today. So I'm going to cue up my playhead to the beginning of my timeline. Let's reposition the center by modifying that X value. Let's bring it all the way, let's say over here. I'm going to make it a round number of -375. And let's crank up that amount so that our text just like totally disappears in there. And I'm going to add a keyframe on that amount. Now I'm going to jump 10 frames in my timeline and let's reduce that amount to 0, creating a new keyframe, and let's play that back. And you see the effect that we get. Okay, so that is how our text is coming in, kind of fun and different. Let's add an overshoot behavior to our entire group. So the group, if you look at our project pane, includes our original text and our 2 clone layers. Let's select that group, head on over to behaviors, parameter, let's grab that overshoot. And on the apply to line, we're going to apply it to properties, transform, rotation, and X. Now let's play with the timing of our overshoot. I'm going to play with this later, but for now, let's just trim the beginning of our overshoot to, I'm at 9 frames here, and let's trim the out to, I don't know, 30 frames. Let's keep our playhead to the beginning of that overshoot, and let's play with the start value, and let's change that start value to a +500. Let's dial down the ramp duration. And let's make that overshoot a little bit longer. This is the kind of thing that's totally personal preference. Now I'm noticing that the overshoot rotation is not really feeling like it's happening from the center of our box. Super easy fix. Let's select the group in our project pane, head on over to properties. Under anchor point, let's drop down and we can actually modify the anchor point on the Z value. I'm just going to make it like -90. Let's see if that feels right. That feels like we're really rotating more from the center of the box. All right, let's add a little bit more life to this. I'm going to add a prism effect to our original box flip text. So let's select it in our project pane. On filters, it's under the blur option. We're going to use this prism effect a little bit differently than we did with our last project. So the first thing I'm going to do is trim up that prism effect so it's really concentrated on when the flip action is happening the most. And we're going to add a behavior to this prism effect. So select it on box flip. Let's head on up to behaviors, parameter, and on this one we're going to select oscillate. And under the apply to line, we're going to go to filters and prism, and we're going to select amount. And you want to make sure you have your keyframe editor open on this. It's going to be really important for you. We want to play with the shape of our oscillate behavior here. So you can see in my keyframe editor, this is the current shape we're getting. You can see it like ramps up and it's a sharp point and a decline. I really want to round this out. So I'm going to play with the speed. And so you see that it gets more of like an even point here. And I think that looks pretty cool. If you wanted less of a prism effect here, if you feel like that's too much, you can crank down the amplitude a little bit. And now let's think about how we want to wrap up this animation. I think I want it to spin out again and then disappear. So I'm going to select the overshoot behavior in my timeline, hit Command C to copy it, Command V to paste it. And it's going to drop it at the beginning of my timeline. I'm going to grab it, push it to the end. And now in my inspector window under the behaviors tab, you see my overshoot copy. We're going to play with these values so that the action actually speeds up instead of slowing down. Let's reduce the start value to 0. Let's crank up that end value. I'm going to put in a value of 3000 here. And let's crank up the acceleration and crank up the ramp duration all the way up. And now you can see in my keyframe editor the shape I'm getting here. You can see it actually speeds up. Let's now go back and grab our prism filter and oscillate behavior. I'm going to select them both, hit Command C to copy, Command V to paste. And I'm going to drag those copies to the end of my timeline. And you can see that that prism effect doesn't really seem to be working. Tricky, tricky, tricky. Let me show you why. Let's head on over to behaviors in our inspector window. And under the oscillate copy, it's saying that it's applying to the filter's prism amount. But guess what? We need to go back to filters and use prism copy amount. And there is our prism effect. And let's just play with the timing of these guys. I'm going to reduce the speed on this oscillate so that the curvature in our keyframe editor better resembles the overshoot. Do you see that? And then we want to make this whole thing fade out. So I'm going to select our entire group, head on up to behaviors, basic motion, fade in, fade out. Let's make the fade in time 0. And let's make the fade out time about 8 frames. Happens real fast. So as our box text speeds up and that prism effect becomes more pronounced, the entire thing fades out. So now before we publish this, let's think about what we might want to be able to adjust in Final Cut. For me, I think I would want to be able to change the center starting point of that black hole. So select the black hole filter. Remember this black hole that we created at the beginning of this animation? And I'm going to go to the center line here and I'm going to publish that because I think depending on how long my text is in Final Cut, I might want to be able to reposition that. And I think other than that, that's the only thing I would change. And there you go. That is our other look. If you want to know more about Apple Motion, take my course, Motion Launchpad. I will link to it down below. You guys, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I picked out some other videos I know you're going to love. I'll see you again.